Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
And glad to have with us Corning Republican Assemblyman Phil Palmesano. Assemblyman, thank you for joining us on your birthday.
Oh, good morning, Brian. It's great to be with you as always.
Happy birthday, Assemblyman Palmesano. So there's some parole changes being legislated. Tell us about what the possibilities are if this gets passed.
Oh, Brian, this is probably one of the most heinous, despicable pieces of legislation that I've seen since I've been in Albany. There's legislation being proposed by the Assembly Democrats and the Senate Democrats, the Democrats in control of Albany, that would say if someone, regardless of the crime they committed, has served 15 years of their sentence that they were sentenced and reached the age of 55, they would automatically be up and eligible for a parole hearing. So for the listeners, put it this way. Say there's a 40-year-old individual who brutally rapes and murders a young girl or a young boy and is sentenced to 30 years to life in prison. Under this legislation that the Democrats in Albany want to push through, under this legislation, that person would be eligible for a parole hearing after just serving 15 years of that 30-year to life sentence. And even if that person is denied parole, what happens is the maximum amount of time for the next hearing is another 2 years. So now that family would have to relive that horrific experience and tragedy in their family every 2 years, reliving every detail about it, going before the parole board who could issue a decision to release that individual. This is such an insult. It's a despicable act, and it's just terrible that they are pushing legislation, and this is just an insult and adds insult to injury, and just basically just thumbs their noses at the victims of crime and their families. And I just can't comprehend why the Democrats in Albany want to push an agenda like this that is more favorable for a criminal, a rapist, a murderer than the victims of criminal acts. And I don't understand. It's just another example of their misplaced priorities. But this is a string of legislation, Brian. You know, we know that they want to provide college tuition, college assistance, free college in prisons for inmates. They want to increase the minimum wage for inmates in our facilities. They want to give them computer tablets, free computer tablets in our prisons. They also are the governor pardoned a bunch of criminals and allowing them to get the right to vote. I mean, give me a break. Where are their priorities? This is just sickening to me. This is probably one of the most despicable, sickening pieces of legislation that I've witnessed up there, and I don't understand where their priorities are, where their head is at. I guess where the priorities are is in favor of the criminal than trying to look out and have some sympathy and compassion for the victims of crime and their families. And I just can't comprehend this legislation, why they would want to do something like this.
So to repeat this again, Assemblyman Palmesano, anyone who does 15 years of prison time and reaches the age of 55, they would be eligible for a parole hearing. And that, do they have any specifications on what type of crimes they committed, or is it all crimes?
No, all crimes. 15 years served and hit the age of 55. I brought that up in the Corrections Committee agenda, and the chairman of the committee, who's the sponsor of the bill, said, well, you know, the parole board would have to take into account the criminal act of it. It doesn't guarantee them release. Well, the problem with this, Brian, is going through the parole hearing is a grueling, traumatic experience. I know the Crandall family in the Hornell area, the Roby family go through this. It is a traumatic experience to go through. And then on top of it, the maximum time you can have between your next parole hearing, the longest of the parole board can set the hearing for is 24 months, 2 years later. So then, again, that family has to relive that whole ordeal every 2 years. And that really, it's every year because they have to start preparing for it a year in advance. it's an insultive piece of legislation, and yet when we bring forth legislation that would provide a little bit of compassion and respite to these victims of murderers, murdered victims, their children or their family member who was murdered by an individual. We had legislation in called Lorraine's Law that would allow the parole board discretion to set that maximum parole hearing instead of the maximum at 24 months up to 60 months based on the crime. And this was only for murderers, not every crime, but just for murder victims, aggravated murder, murder in the first degree, murder in the second degree. But the Democrats in Albany continue to block this legislation. It had passed the Senate several years in a row when the Senate Republicans were in the majority, but the Assembly Democrats blocked it. And now that the Senate Democrats are in control, who knows if they'll ever let that come to the floor for a vote. But it's all about where their priorities. It's about the criminal. It's not about the crime victim and their families. And this has probably got to be one of the most heinous, irresponsible acts of legislation I've seen. I think it's criminalizing are the victims of crime and their families. So it's another criminal act that's taking place, but this one at the hands of elected officials in Albany who think they know best. And I'm just appalled by this. I'm sickened by this legislation. We're going to push back and fight against this. But if, God forbid, they move this legislation forward, it would be a very sad day in New York State.
Assemblyman Palmesano, a couple questions here. Number one, when President Trump had the majority, the Democrats were able to do a lot of procedural moves to stall legislation they did not want. The Republicans moving forward, and I'm talking about Washington, obviously. Are there any legislative procedures or moves or techniques that the Republicans, who are really in the minority now in New York State politics, will be able to do?
The only thing that really we have at our disposal to do, which we will do, is debate this bill vociferously on the floor of the Assembly and hopefully on the same on the Senate. And I think just calling public attention to this legislation, hopefully people will call and write elected officials around the state and the governor saying, do not advance this horrific piece of legislation. So we will debate this bill. We will hold them accountable. We will make them get on the record on what this vote in support of this bill would actually do. It would be a vote in support of murderers, rapists, people who commit heinous acts of crime against individuals, and then basically thumbing their nose at the victims of crime and their families. So we will do everything we can to use our offices and our debates to put a spotlight on this issue. But it's just absolutely sickening to me, Brian. When I think about this legislation, I physically almost get sick to my stomach. At the same time, they block this legislation that we propose that would extend those maximum time for parole hearings, that would benefit families like the Crandall family and the Roby family and other families in our communities. I just don't get the rationale behind these legislators who push an agenda like this. And again, it's just a series of bills. We talked about it. Again,
Assemblyman, let me stop you there. You say you don't understand the mentality. Is the mentality really coming from the New York City Democrats' attitude? And you say this is New York City Assemblymen and senators on the Democrat side. Is this the New York City attitude of all accusations made by law enforcement are false accusations, nobody's guilty of anything?
Well, they don't want people in prisons. They're closing down prisons. They're making it harder to arrest people. Now they got these discovery laws are going to make things much more difficult for these new discovery laws are going to make, if you talk to people in law enforcement, it's going to, and the new cashless no bail system is going to make things much more difficult for our law enforcement communities. I mean, it's just another step that takes away tools from our law enforcement, the brave men and women who go out and do a dangerous job every day to keep their communities safe. The New York City Assembly Democrats and Senate Democrats, but they're being aided and abetted by the upstate Assembly Democrats and the Long Island Democrats, and the same thing in the Senate. They're not standing up to these guys, to their leadership, because this is heinous legislation. Why they would want to put it forward is beyond me. This is not in the best interest of Democrats in upstate New York or in Long Island. But yet they kowtow and cave and do whatever their leadership tells them, and I'm just appalled by it. This is just ridiculous legislation. I even saw a colleague of mine from upstate New York defending the legislation on the news last night. I'm sickened by this. This is wrong. This is just this is a despicable piece of legislation. It's insulting, it is hurtful, and it is plain out simply wrong to advance this legislation in New York State. And I will do everything I can, and I know my colleagues will, if this bill comes up on the floor, debate this bill, point out how atrocious this bill is. And it's just, again, another pattern in legislation that will help criminals versus at the expense of taxpayers. Again, we talked about free tablets in college. They also want to give them increased minimum wage, and also they want to provide free busing for the families of murderers and rapists so their families can come visit them in prison. So think about this from this perspective. If you're a crime victim or who was raped, or if you're a family who had a family member who was killed, now your tax dollars are going to go subsidize family members to get on a bus and pay for that bus so they can go see their loved one in prison who murdered. Their loved one's still alive while the other one is not. This is just. If I sound like I'm angry, it's because I'm absolutely furious when I think about these policies, Brian. It's wrong, and someone needs to stand up and say something, and hopefully, God forbid any of this legislation ever passed, Governor Cuomo would veto it. But, of course, Governor Cuomo last year pardoned somewhere in the neighborhood of 30,000 individuals so they could now get the right to vote. And I just think that's just despicable action. Governor Cuomo pardoned or commuted the session, pardoned Judith Clark, the one who...
Yeah, I was going to bring that up. Judith Clark was a member of the notorious Weather Underground and was, the getaway driver in a 1981 downstate New York Brinks robbery?
Right. And the thing about that is he pardoned, he said, well, what he did is he said, well, I kind of looked, and what that allowed her is to be eligible for parole. And instead of if he wouldn't have taken action, she wouldn't have been up for parole for I think 10 to 20 more years. But that allowed her up for parole right away. And he said, well, I looked at her, what she'd done in prison, helping people, getting an education. Well, that's fine and dandy. But you know what Governor Cuomo didn't do? He didn't meet with any of the family members who were murdered by that. He didn't listen to them. He only looked at that. And then the person who made the deciding vote on that case to give her parole is married to a murderer who was paroled. Think about that. Isn't there not a conflict of interest? Someone on the parole board who is married to a murderer who was paroled. There's a conflict of interest. This individual who was actually served as a staffer to the Assembly Correction Committee previously voted to release a murderer. And there's certainly a conflict of interest because she's married to a murderer who was released on parole.
And she was, 3 people died in that bank robbery. Am I correct, Assemblyman?
Yes, they did. Absolutely. There are several people, I believe, that died. I can't remember the exact number. But
3, I'm looking at the New York Times headline, 3 killed in armored car holdup, October 21st, 1981. That's a headline from the New York Times.
Yes, absolutely, Brian. I mean, that's what we're doing. But the governor took the action. He appointed that person to the parole board who was a murderer or who was married to a murderer. So why was that person even appointed to the parole board? You got me. I have no idea. And those are the people who are making these decisions on people come before parole for murder. So this is just a pattern that we continue to see from the Democrats in Albany, and I'm sickened by it. And I think the listeners should be sickened by it. And I just hope people call the governor and write to governor and write to other elected officials around the state, and this word gets out. Please do not advance this dangerous and just very insulting and despicable legislation.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break talking to Assemblyman Phil Palmesano. When we come back, we're going to talk about how environmentalists want Governor Cuomo to speed up the process for getting wind and solar projects going. Stay with us.
This is a special announcement for all Americans who owe back taxes to the IRS or state. Pay attention. There's a special toll-free hotline set up especially for you. This hotline will give you free information on how you can legally reduce or eliminate your tax debt. Call the taxpayer hotline today at 800-459-1725. Grab a pen or put the number in your cell phone, 800-459-1725. You'll speak with qualified professionals who tell you how to stop the collection calls, IRS letters, bank levies, and wage garnishments, and And they'll deal directly with the IRS on your behalf so you don't have to. Even if you haven't filed returns or you are already in a payment plan, you can still get relief. New IRS settlement policies have opened the doors for a fresh start. But hurry, this won't last forever, and your tax problem will only get worse if you do nothing or try to handle it yourself. It makes a big difference in who you call. So call the Taxpayer Hotline today for free information. 800-459-1725. 800-459-1725.
That time again to check in with meteorologist Gary Bass.
Today's going to be pretty good. We'll have a lot of sunshine during this morning, and then we're going to see increasing clouds a bit later on this afternoon. But all in all, a decent day coming up, Brian. Temperatures will be well up in the 60s, near 70 in spots. But, yeah, we've got clouds and rain on the way again for tonight. Low temperature down between 50 and 55. Cloudy, breezy, and periods of rain on Friday. High temperature just a bit over 60. But that rain ends Friday night, then partial clearing. Breezy on Friday night, turning a bit cooler, down into the upper 30s. And Saturday, a windy and cool day with partly sunny skies. Temperatures then around 50. More rain or showers, though, could arrive again during Sunday.
Back with Assemblyman Phil Palmesano. Assemblyman, what do you make of this letter that the environmentalist groups have sent to Governor Cuomo? They say that because of global warming, they need to speed up the site process for wind and solar projects. They want them to happen right away. Can't wait because of global warming. What do you make of that?
Well, Brian, I think, listen, we have a processes in place. There is an Article 10 process and Article 7 process that deals with developing of generation and transmission. That process is in place for a reason, to make sure there's the proper things that happen and follow-through happens, and also to make sure you have proper input and oversight, especially input from the local communities where these things are taking place. I understand why they want to advance wind and solar faster than anything else, but you can't. I don't think you can just do it for one industry. If you're going to do it for wind and solar, you better do it for natural gas too, because natural gas is an important part of our fuel mix and our energy mix in this state and this country. Although the governor and the legislature seem to have a habitual attitude towards natural gas. I mean, what they're doing is the governor has single-handedly blocked, and his administration has blocked the development of interstate pipeline projects, which bring natural gas into our communities across the state and into the Northeast. And what that has done has caused a problem. It's caused a bottleneck. We have abundant supply. It's just we can't get the gas, the wholesale gas, to where it needs to be. That's why in Westchester County, Con Edison has put a moratorium on any more new natural gas customers. There's a pipeline project going through that will down through New York City and up through with one of National Grid, one of our other utilities, that if this project is not approved, will jeopardize the providing natural gas to the projects in New York City, and also for converting oil boilers in New York City to natural gas. There's been a process in place to convert those oil boilers, which are much more dirtier, much more worse for our environment, and to convert those to natural gas. That would stop some of that from happening. But this is an attitude we've seen from this administration, not just banning fracking and hydraulic fracturing in New York State, but also just allowing the gas to get here from other communities. Listen, people heat their homes with natural gas, and when you put that constriction, when the gas can't get from point A to point B, that affects the whole market. And what that's going to do, that's going to drive up prices for everybody, natural gas and heating prices and energy prices for everyone, for our businesses, for our seniors, for our agricultural community. Listen, I understand why environmentalists want to fast-track the sitting process, but the process is a process. It's there for a reason. You need to make sure you have local input, and anything that's fast-tracked better be for the entire industry. So we'll see what happens with that, but I'm not surprised that they're trying to fast-track anything. They always try to do what they think's best, but they're entitled to have their opinion. But we can't just be just doing it without letting due diligence take place and making sure local communities have input and say on what's happening in their community.
So I guess what you're saying is, and I hope I'm not putting words in your mouth, the environmentalists want to speed it up for the things that they like, but they want to shut down any projects they don't approve of.
Yeah, I mean, they definitely don't want natural gas to be.
That's what I was. Yeah,
our fuel mix for sure, no question about it. And listen, I'm not an opponent of wind and solar. I believe that should be part of our fuel mix. I'm a supporter of wind and solar. I think that's a good thing to have. Just like you invest, but I think we need a broad investment in our fuel mix, just like you invest in your 401k or your IRA. You don't put it all in cash, stocks, or bonds. You diversify it. Our fuel mix should be diversified. Yes, wind, solar, hydro. I'm a big believer in those things. But nuclear and also natural gas should be a part of our fuel mix and our fuel portfolio. And when we talk about our energy portfolio, listen, our energy policies, yes, clean energy needs to be a part of it. I talk about it as a three-legged stool. One leg is clean, but the other two legs are affordable and reliable. And with solar and wind, because they're intermittent, Brian, you need to have backup conventional means of energy sources, so i.e. natural gas or whatever it may be, to back that up to make sure you're providing a reliable and affordable flow of energy to meet the needs of businesses and farmers and residents and things of that nature. So it needs to be balanced. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people that don't, when they think of that stool, they only look at one leg of it, clean. And a stool doesn't stand with just one leg unless you're very balanced and very talented.
Assemblyman, there was a couple other questions I wanted to get to. We are out of time. I did want to ask you, with AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the downstate congresswoman, pushing environmentalist concerns about cows, would you support public restrooms for cows?
Oh, my God, Brian. I think the public restroom for the cows are where they are, where they're grazing, where they're being. The Green New Deal that's being proposed federally, and also, the governor has his own Green New Deal that would make it 100% carbon-free by 2040. I just think, and there's other legislation to do that, that would be devastating, especially if New York tried to take that on themselves, even the country trying to take them on by themselves. Listen, New York only contributes 3.3% of the total carbon emissions in the entire country, and only 0.5% globally. We can't do it alone. If we try to do it alone, all we're going to do is ship our manufacturing businesses to Connecticut, Ohio, Pennsylvania, who don't have as strict as regulations. We're going to lose our airports. Our cars would all have to be electrified. We wouldn't have gas cars anymore. Our agricultural community would be devastated. 90+% of the farms in New York State are family-owned farms. We wouldn't have agriculture in New York State anymore. I just don't get the rationale behind this. You think about the cost, billions and billions and billions of dollars to retrofit businesses and homes who are getting their heat and their power through natural gas and their generation from natural gas. That would be just devastating. And quite frankly, to the listeners, the reason we have decreased carbon emissions since 1990 so significantly is because of the rise in use and development of natural gas across our country. That's helped drop our carbon emissions. But that's not good enough for environmentalists who just want to say, no natural gas, only wind, solar, things of that nature. That's not going to do it enough. It's not realistic. And I support wind and solar. It's a part of our energy portfolio. But we can't do it alone. It's intermittent. It needs backup conventional means. And until we develop the storage that can handle that, and right now we haven't, and we have a long way to go to do that, we need natural gas to be part of our portfolio, and I hope this governor doesn't keep stymieing these important pipeline projects that transport wholesale natural gas into our state so we can meet the needs of our business community, our manufacturers, high energy intensity users, so we can continue to convert these oil boilers in New York City to natural gas, which is better for the environment than these oil boilers. I just don't understand the rationale. We have to keep pushing on this. And so, yes, I think there's a Green New Deal. The only thing green about it, quite frankly, Brian, is the amount of money it's going to cost residents, ratepayers, businesses, manufacturers, farmers, and each and every one of us. That's the green thing about it.
Assemblyman, we are out of time and have to leave it there. We were going to talk about organ donation. We'll get to that next time. Also, volunteer firefighters are having open houses in Cohocton and the town of Atlanta. Assemblyman, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Brian.